And now, welcome back to the HBEST Virtual Roundtable series. I'm Paul Deutschman. I'm a graduate student at Boston College and one of the organizers of the series, along with Courtney Crosby, Christopher Smith, and Saeed Rizvani Najad. Before we start, we'd again like to thank the Executive Council of HBEST for their support in making this series possible. Because this is an HBEST-sponsored meeting, please note that this meeting is subject to the HBEST Code of Conduct, which has been shared in the chat. Anyone who violates the Code of Conduct may be removed from the session. We'd like to encourage audience participation throughout the event. So if you have a question, please submit it in the question box on the bottom right corner of the screen. And please just try to keep your questions to a sentence or two. Also, please feel free to upvote questions asked by other audience members that you would like to see answered, and that'll bump it up the list. And finally, everything is being recorded today and will be posted publicly to YouTube after the event. One note, unfortunately, Dr. Esther Herman is sick today and will not be able to join the discussion, but we're lucky to have a bunch of other great panelists. So without further ado, today's discussion will be on the evolution of reputation. And moderating our event today is Dr. Felix Warneken. Felix is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, where he researches the origins and development of cooperation, studying the processes that underlie cooperative and altruistic behavior in children and great apes. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Felix.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and the rest of the committee for organizing this. It's really exciting. Really early on, we already mentioned this is kind of a breakfast table rather than a round table, given the early time for us, at least on Eastern Standard Time, and even more so for Alex, 1 hour over. So I'm very excited and want to just briefly mention how we will proceed. So we'll first ask our 3 experts to introduce themselves and briefly describe some of the main research they have been doing. And then I will ask some questions to dig a little deeper and try to maybe compare how people in different research traditions study the evolution of reputation. And hopefully have some discussion also amongst ourselves, not just the Q&A, and then we'll move it over to the questions from the audience. So as Paul said, please put a question in the chat so that we can open it up at some later point during the session. So I'll just call people as they're seated on this virtual couch from left to right. So Alex, please tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Alex Shaw. I do research on reputation in adults and children. I do about half and half. And I wrote a paper early in my career called Reputation is Everything. And that was a focus of my research in a lot of graduate school, really focusing on reputational concerns when they start to emerge in children. But I realized that is more of a question than an answer when you say reputation is everything. It's really a question about what kind of reputation that you want to pursue. And that's what a lot of my research tries to highlight, that when you say you want a good reputation, you have to say good for what? There are some things that are pretty good overall. Like, I guess being a kind person seems pretty good, unless you're in jail and now you need to try to cultivate a reputation as being a very tough and very aggressive person. Being fair sounds like a really good idea too, but in some circumstances, that means that you're not going to be loyal to people who are very close to you. Being honest again sounds really good, but maybe if you see my haircut and you think that it's kind of terrible, maybe being honest isn't the best strategy if you're trying to pursue certain kinds of reputations. And that's really what my research has focused on, thinking about the conflicting kinds of reputations that we need to pursue in different circumstances, and really trying to drill down on the different kinds of concerns that these kind of fuzzier social constructs push us towards. So for example, a lot of my research has been on fairness. And what my research on fairness has suggested is that fairness, although it seems like this good thing and it can be really good in lots of circumstances, it can lead us sometimes to make suboptimal decisions where we're pushed to destroy resources rather than be unfair to other people. Is that about the right level of detail for things?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Obviously, we'll have follow-up questions, but that really gives us good perspective of what it is you're doing. Okay, and then we have Amanda Rotella. Please tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Rotella. I'm a new lecturer at Kingston University in London. Broadly, I study cooperation and competition, basically who cooperates, when, and why. I use a biological markets perspective, which I think Alex kind of just really touched on, which is where, making good partner choices, whether social or on the mating market, will have fitness payoffs, and this will be selected over time, and that this will vary based on market dynamics. And so some people will be chosen under some contexts, and others will be chosen in different contexts. So I use this to make predictions about when and why people will choose certain partners, how they will signal, and which reputational information they'll want to signal. And I study social effects like moral licensing, which are like consecutive moral behavior. So like how your reputation will be affected when you're initially moral, and people often behave subsequently less moral. So why is that not the case? So yeah, I look at when and why these social effects will emerge, the effects of observability, and how that affects reputation and signaling broadly.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. And last but not least, Eris.
Thank you. I'm Eris, and I am engaged in sort of two lines of research. One is more theoretical, using game theory to understand quirky features of our altruistic tendencies. And in fact, we have a book coming out on that. If you're interested, ask me and I'll send you some details. And then the other line of research is very, very applied. How do we take what the various literatures in bio and the social sciences and so on tell us? This is Mookie, she wants to join. And use that to actually motivate more cooperation in the field? Can we get people to do things like actually set up their furnaces properly so that their furnaces don't use energy needlessly? Or can we get them to give to better charities? Or can we get them to be safer drivers and things like that? So obviously all of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today has implications for cooperation in practice. Can we use it? What is the kind of guidance that we can give somebody who's a CEO or a policymaker, and not just give them a bunch of math, game theory math or something like that, or some simulations in order to try to sort it out for themselves?
Great, thanks very much. So, I mean, the first question I have is that maybe touches upon all three of your comments about like what kind of reputation in what kind of context and what the different consequences can be, is like to what extent we really think about reputation in the sense of a good thing or a bad thing, right? I mean, think about Joan Jett, a rock star with net worth of $10 million, and that came about by her singing "I Don't Give a Damn About My Bad Reputation." So it seems like a reputation by itself does not yet mean that that you strive for a good reputation. So can you speak a little bit more specifically about the kinds of contexts in which reputation can actually foster something that more generally is wanted by society versus something that might actually make things go downhill? So I open it up for anyone who would like to speak to that. And if not, I'd cold call people.
To avoid cold calling, I'll go first. I'll leave the positive aspects of this to Erez. It sounds like he has a lot of really interesting research on that. I have some ideas about that. I think there are cases where reputation can promote these kind of things. There's lots of people who are kind of crappy, and they are less crappy when they know that other people are watching. But even for people who are generally good, we're not always good all the time. Sometimes we're grumpy and other things. And I think in those circumstances, reputation is going to be a really good lever that can cause people to have like the better angels of their nature come out. However, I think the thing I'll focus on instead is where I think it can be negative. I think that reputational concerns often lead to dishonesty. There are cases where people have honest opinions about things that they're not willing to share because they're concerned about the reputational consequences. We also know that the majority is not always right. In fact, in many circumstances, the majority is quite wrong. So reputational concerns by Galileo during the time where he was observing things about the planets that other people didn't quite believe were probably not the right way to focus on that kind of thing and push science forward. And so I can imagine in science, a lot of the time, these reputational concerns are going to be quite bad. It's going to cause people to not take strong positions on things and other things along those lines. In a related vein, virtue signaling is something you see quite a lot. People don't believe in certain kinds of opinions, I think, and they feel like they have to stake these opinions out. This is why I stay away from the hellhole that is Twitter, because it's a market where there really is just social signaling all over the place and virtue signaling all over the place. So I guess I would say that those seem like really some of the pernicious ways that reputation can drive things in the wrong kind of way. But I want to just quickly highlight that almost all of these are going to be double-edged swords, right? So virtue signaling can also be a quite positive thing. I think that it can be spreading really good ideas and things like that. So I think it's going to be a really complicated story with reputation. It's a tool like anything else, and it's a tool, it depends how you hold it. It can be a weapon or something for really positive influences.
Yeah, Amanda, so you mentioned that you did studies on like how partner choice influences that. So that would be also something where, is it the case, for example, if there is like a very diverse market, then it really, you can do whatever you want as long as you find the right group to associate with. Whereas if there's constraints, then you really have to go with what it is that you, for better or worse, again, what your group norm is. Is that the case?
Yeah, as I was going to add to that, yeah, there's different environments, right, where reputations will be selected for. If you're living in a very harsh and unpredictable environment with resource scarcity, well, being nice might get you taken advantage of and you do worse off. So you won't want to signal those kind of traits, at least to strangers in those environments. You'd want to signal things that would kind of establish you as somebody who wouldn't be a victim. So toughness, that you won't be taken advantage of, and that could even lead to violence and other things as well, to harness that reputation, to be like, you don't want to mess with me. So there are certain contexts where those signaling those traits and earning a reputation like that will have fitness benefits, and so it will be selected for in those kind of environments. And yeah, so a reputation, it really depends on the eyes of the observer and the purpose, right? So like having that better reputation can be very beneficial for the individual in those contexts. But somebody looking from the outside might think that's a bad reputation, but somebody on the inside be like, yes, I want to align myself with this person. They can protect me and I will do better overall. So it really depends on a lot of context dependent things, and environmental variables. And with that said, like we know that reputation and signaling is often subjected to like in-group biases. And so people will want to signal reputations in those contexts to say, yes, I'm part of the group, even if they might not be good reputations overall. So like, for example, like in political arenas, like you might want to signal things that are consistent with the political values of that group. More recently, pandemic, it could be like vaccination opinions, anti-masking opinions. You'll get a reputation for whatever your opinion is, and you want it to be consistent with that group. Otherwise, you'll have repercussions for that. So that you can earn a reputation with that group that is valued, but might not be valued to outside people. So yeah, it can harness bad reputations or good reputations, but it really depends on who the context and who the observer is.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So Erez, what did you find maybe in your more applied side to where you have certain goals of people making more ecologically responsible choices? What do you find are the conditions that need to be in place for people to do the right thing?
One of the things that needs to be in place actually relates to this question here, which is the behavior already considered normative within the group in question? If it's not, we're going to need to do some groundwork in order to do that. That typically involves a fair amount of basically coordination amongst the group members. Those it obviously will depend a little bit about how the group tends to enforce its norms, but we need to get both the people who do the enforcement and the people who tend to communicate that, or the people who tend to motivate those who do the enforcement, or and so on, to actually be on board with that. So usually a lot of public communications from the top, that we're going to shift the norm. A lot of focus on creating common knowledge that the norm is changing. So that's step one. Once the behavior starts to be normative, or if it's already normative, then what we're doing is basically just creating an environment in which the reputations have a chance to work. That's going to require things like ensuring that there's observability, which has been mentioned before by the panel, That's kind of the number one thing we look for. But there's also some other things. Again, we have to worry about common knowledge effects. Reputations are somewhat coordinated. We have to make sure that when somebody takes an action that that's tightly linked to their reputation. That usually involves thinking about things like plausible deniability. Are there lots of plausible excuses for not doing this behavior? And therefore, the fact that I know this person intentionally didn't abide by the norm, does that mean that other people also know that, or will they think there might be some plausible excuse at play, and therefore not sort of join me in punishing or rewarding the individual when they should? And we really kind of need that joint rewards and punishments for reputations to work as they should. And finally, reputations are sometimes linked to action, sometimes not. There's lots of environments when the you're not really expected to take an action. It doesn't really link to your reputation. The example I often give is escalators. You know, in London, for instance, you're supposed to stand on the right, and if you don't, then people as you're blocking their way. But in many places in the United States, nobody cares. And so there's an action where you could be doing something that's good for others. It's only expected in some places. As a consequence, we're probably pretty sensitive to whether in particular environment we're supposed to be taking an action. And so a lot of our work and a lot of the behavioral sciences work in general is kind of around clever ways of communicating expectations and showing that those, even though they seem kind of trivial, will often have a big effect. So those are the three things: observability, these common knowledge effects, which I often kind of lump in with plausible deniability, and expectations. And so we do that once we have the behavior already being normative.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. I think as a next theme, I maybe want us to learn a little bit more about how you get to these kinds of conclusions. So if you could describe a little bit more about how you do your research. So let's Amanda, would you start?
Sure. So one way I study this is a little bit different than in most people in the field. So one context, so I use meta-analysis a lot and in a different way. So one effect I mentioned earlier was moral licensing, which is a paper I'm currently revising and resubmitting, where it's originally people act cooperative or moral and then subsequently act less cooperative or moral. And it's like, why? And that question hasn't been asked, even though the effect's been around for a while, and there's 20 years worth of studies. But one thing is that not everybody uses the same experimental paradigms. There's a lot of variation within people's experiments. Are people in the same room? Are they being watched? Is the experimenter there? So I go into the literature and kind of pick out and code these studies, being like, they were watched, they were not watched, and compare the effect sizes to look at how observability will influence this effect, to kind of see how reputation is established. So like if somebody's being watched, you can assume there will be some kind of reputational information. If there's no opportunity for observation, they're in a room alone, they're doing the study online, then you can assume there is no reputation. And so that's something that I've been doing a little bit differently, where I'm using meta-analysis and natural variation in like study procedures to look at reputational effects. Now, other methods that I'm getting more into is I am looking at socio-ecological variables and sociocultural variables, and looking at how that does influence competition, and using existing data to look at change over time, and again, like looking at how reputations might vary according to these environments. But that's one direction I'm currently going in, and haven't done a lot in yet. But I think it's a really interesting and avenue for research for going forward.
Great. And so you recently did also meta-analysis on this eye spots phenomenon. Can you right? There's some like to what extent there is some subtle effects on being observed. Is that so? What's the deal with that? I mean, this has been around, this idea, for a long time, and kind of ups and downs and whether we believe in it or not. So what's the newest?
So on like so subtle effects on being observed. I haven't done a meta-analysis.
Oh, sorry, no, you were sorry. I was good for with sorry, I mix it up with the different meta-analysis you did about the
That's
pie
fair.
size. Sorry about that. But I just a general question about let's open this up to the meta-analyses on the eye spots phenomenon. To what extent, because that is one of these things where meta-analyses seem to really be important, because nobody ever claimed that this is like a major effect, right? So this is something where you really depend on aggregating over large data sets. So what's the newest on this phenomenon?
I'm not overly familiar with the icebox
I think
phenomenon.
he means the honor box with the donuts. Is that what
Oh,
you're talking
that.
about? The eye spots?
Yes,
Felix?
The
eye
eye
spots.
spots were-
Oh,
Yes,
yeah,
watching
yeah.
eyes.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did I say?
You said ice box, I think, over
Oh,
like I think
no,
you were
yeah,
hearing
that's
ice box.
German,
I thought that's what you meant.
dialect. No,
Okay, yeah.
ice spots
Didn't draw that
phenomenon.
connection,
Yeah,
but yes. Yeah, so actually, I have published on the watching eyes effect. I failed to replicate a past study, so that's leading me in new directions, and am doing collaborating on a meta-analysis looking at this. But yeah, there's been recently a meta-analysis in the past couple of years, Bradley and all, it was great. They looked at effects of observability, and what they did find is that, particularly for the eyes effect, which is just an effect where there's eye spots, and they think that these invalid cues of reputation will increase people's cooperativeness, prosociality, or decrease like bad behaviors. And they found that the eyes effect really just existed for, or at least in the context of negative behaviors, so to reduce bad behaviors. And so the effect is still highly controversial. There's a lot of failed replications, but I think what that highlights is that there are different kinds of reputation, and potentially when there are more costs or benefits, you might be more likely to pay attention to these invalid cues to change your behavior. So like it's probably worse for you to get a reputation as acting badly than acting well. So it's in all likelihood that there might be different contexts where this effect will be more or less likely to exist.
Okay, great. Thanks for the update. Okay, right. So how do you do your research?
I guess I go back to the very brief comment I made earlier about combining a bit of game theory with the more applied side. You kind of start with these very, very simple game theory models that say, what does this environment look like? Or, even simpler than that. Okay, the environment is somewhat complex because there's repeated interactions and things like that, typically with reputations. Can we simplify it further and still gain some insight? And then look at the conditions for having cooperative equilibria. And people, most of the audience members are probably familiar with some of these results. Things like delta has to be high relative to C over B in a repeated game, like the prisoner's dilemma, where delta is the likelihood of a repeated interaction. Other things that people often highlight are the reciprocal nature or the conditional nature of equilibria in these environments where you're kinder to people if they've been kind to you in the past. That has to be present in equilibrium. But there are other things too, like the fact that you need first order knowledge in order for reputations to come into effect, like the fact that higher order beliefs and common knowledge come into play, like the fact that you have multiple equilibria in these environments and therefore expectations matter a lot. Those statements that I just made, those are technical statements about the equilibrium conditions and the various equilibria in the game. What we need to do then is to turn that into English and connect that with the vast literature in psych and behavioral econ, and I guess other fields too, but primarily in those two fields, that gives us lots of examples of, say, observability interventions or interventions that have something to do with communication, communicating expectations, and therefore might have to do with this thing related to communicating to multiple equilibria. And so there's a bit of effort there to bridging the existing work, that this large, often clever, beautiful literature that's a bit of a mess on the behavioral side, with the simple insights from these almost trivial game theory models, and then connecting that, organizing that, and being able to communicate that also to an audience that maybe doesn't care how you came up with it so much, just that wants to know what works. And so that's where a lot of the work it also goes in. A little bit of the modeling, a little bit of the figuring out how to word things and which papers are relevant for illustrating examples, and are there good papers for illustrating border conditions under which things won't work, and so on.
Okay, great, thanks very much. Yeah, and Alex, so how do you do this developmental work to look at the origins and change of reputation?
Sure. I'll briefly mention some adult work too, but I'll also talk about developmental, just really briefly, just because of what I talked about before about being forced to kind of take sides maybe and feeling pressure about these things. In a lot of my work, what I do is, so I do a lot of work where we just run vignettes and we ask people's third-party judgments. And I know economists hate this kind of stuff and there is some objection to it. And I think there are cases where they're asking people what they would do in some situation is not super helpful. So if you ask someone, would you be really nice to this person in this situation? I think that's going to give you a very small indication of what they're talking about, of like whether they will be nice. But for reputational stuff that we're talking about, where the question is, how are you going to judge someone for what they did? That is exactly what we're in most of the time. Anytime you go online and you see a news story, that's precisely what's happening. You're not asked to give any money. The question is related to a question someone has here about gossip. Are you going to talk to your friend about how shitty you think the Squid Games are? Or are you going to complain? Or are you going to talk about Army Hammer's like bad sex habits and things like that? These are all questions that really are just these third-party judgments about things. Anyway, so I'll briefly say, so what we do is we run experiments. One of the things that we've done is we've looked at how people respond to neutrality from people. So you might think, well, of course, if you just take a neutral position on an issue, people will think that you feel neutrally about that issue. But we show in lots of circumstances that isn't true. So if, for example, I was in front of a conservative audience and somebody asked me my opinion on abortion, and I said I decided not to offer an opinion, people do not think that I am neutral on that issue. They think that I am in favor of abortion, and they also think that I am someone who should be distrusted, even more so than someone who actually states their opinion about those kind of things. And we think that this actually leads to lots of circumstances where people feel like they sometimes have to offer opinions because they understand that, one, people will think that they have the opposite opinion and also will distrust them in some way. But to Felix's first question about development, I do a lot of stuff on children. I think it's really important to understand how children think about this kind of stuff. One thing that's nice with children is you can see a phenomena come online in them, which is something we can't really do in adults. By the time you're an adult, you're ruined. You have like a bunch of different experiences. It's really hard to know what kind of experiences cause some kind of cognition to come online. But in kids, you can see this pretty clearly. I'll just mention one finding that I think is really interesting, and it's the kind of research, I don't think it's a great, the goal of this research, I think, is what I would like to see a lot of developmental and especially cross-cultural developmental work look at. So what happened is, you guys have probably heard the idea that people in China care more about modesty than people in the States, for example. And I think that's true. It does seem to be true. But I had a student who said, I mean, that's kind of true, but not really completely true. I guess he was saying like, the idea is like, maybe people in China just don't care about their reputation as much. That's why they're modest. And he said, that's not true. Like when kids in China say that they don't really believe that much in themselves, no one really takes that to mean that they don't believe in themselves. And so we ran some studies to actually look at this in both the US and China. So we tell kids about a situation in which somebody says, I think I can really win the race, or someone says, I don't know, maybe I can do it. I'll give it a try. And what we find in both the US and China is an increase in liking the kid who's modest. So if you say, who do you want on your team? Who do you like better? Kids like the modest person rather than the person who is overly confident. But what's interesting that was different in the US and China is that in the US, people take that modesty to be an indication that the person doesn't believe in themselves. And the audience also thinks that the person isn't very good. So if you ask a kid in the States, is this kid going to win the race? They say very strongly no, and he doesn't believe he's going to win the race. In China, this is very different. There is a small cost, but it's very small. So essentially, they think that the modest kid believes in himself a tiny bit less, but in general, they think that he's still very capable of winning the race. And so I think what this highlights is, I think sometimes when we see differences between two different cultures, we think it's like a completely different process. Like you could imagine some people saying, yeah, the Chinese just don't care about their reputation as much. I think it's really just a matter of understanding what kinds of reputation people are pursuing. And you can see very different behaviors actually do fall under this broader rubric of reputation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for your insights and about how you do your work with some highlighted findings. So, well, we'll now open it up to the questions from the audience. So maybe start with one that follows up on what you discussed with regard to potential mechanisms. So we have a question from Paul. What is the role and importance of gossip in reputation? So I want to add that. So Esther unfortunately can't be here. So she studies chimpanzees in comparison to human children. So where, for example, I mean, this points to something really important, that maybe there is certain kinds of reputational effects in chimpanzees. You could imagine that based on observing others and choosing those that are maybe more cooperative or don't beat you up and so forth, and maybe also some third-party observation of what's going on. But gossip, for example, there's just no way that would happen, right? That the information travels from one individual to another. So that seems to be a really important, or it's certainly a unique thing in humans. So what do you think is the role and importance of gossip? Anyone wants to take this on?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about it. I'm not overly familiar with the gossip literature, but it is a fascinating literature. So gossip is very important for reputation in even populations. But what's really important and interesting is that gossip is strategic. So people will gossip more in contexts where it makes sense to gossip more, where they are in more competition. If they want to derogate or even promote people will, when there are incentives to, they will be more likely to gossip and convey information that will impact their reputation. There's a great new issue in Philosophical Transactions on basically reputation honest signaling. There's a few good papers on gossip, which I highly recommend to look at. But yeah, people will strategically choose how to communicate information, who to communicate it to, and in what context to affect people's reputation in order to achieve like strategic goals or interests.
Not only is that true, but 5-year-olds understand that fact. So research from my lab and some others suggests that people understand that people do gossip strategically. So by the time kids are about 5 or 6, they understand that. So let's say you guys don't know whether I know Felix or not, but let's say Felix and I are friends. If I say, Felix is kind of ugly or something like that, then that is more informative than if you know that Felix and I are enemies and I say that he's ugly, and vice versa for him being smart. If we're enemies and I say Felix is really smart, then Felix must be really smart. And if we're friends, if I say he's really smart, maybe he's really smart. So obviously as adults, we recognize this, but some recent research from myself and Zoe Liberman suggests that by the time kids are 5 or 6, they seem to appreciate that. They appreciate exactly what Amanda said, which is that people are biased to say positive things about their friends and negative things about enemies, and then learn to appropriately discount those things.
Yeah, that's a really cool finding. And I mean, 5 years seems to be kind of a watershed moment, right? When it comes to reputational concerns in kids. Yeah, so it's great. Okay, let me move on to the next question here from Pat Barkley. The question is, when in-group loyalty conflicts with what's good for society, so for example, anti-vaxxers signaling their commitment, how can we reduce the reputational value of those actions which are bad for society as a whole?
I think this one's one for me. I think it's really tough. It's not something that we can just kind of snap our fingers and make happen. There's kind of two ways that I think of approaching the problem. One is you've got to work with the community itself to establish norms that are more in line with the overall population's interests. In the case of anti-vaxxers, or in the case of anti-vaxxers is really rough because there you have a real strong free riding problem. But anti-maskers was, I think, an easier problem in some ways because wearing a mask was in the interest of these communities, except for the signaling value that being anti-vaxxer ended up having. But there you'd want to do things like team up with the Harley Davidson clubs and team up with local mayors and stuff to try to figure out ways of messaging that are consistent with the community's values, but promote the behavior of interest. So you don't want to use your values to try to, and for it to be coming from you, it needs to be coming from within the community and to be tapping into their values. So one is you have to try to actually change what's normative. And I think that the tricks I just described are some ways to do that. The other thing is you can try to basically flip the checklist I gave you before and try to undermine the people's ability to use the behavior to gain reputation. You can try to reduce observability. You can try to increase the amount of plausible deniability, and you can try to mix the signals and basically jam the signal when it comes to expectations. I've never seen people do this successfully, but in theory, it should be possible. And one should be able to make it harder to be, say, a racist, or say harder to be an anti-vaxxer using this technique. And it is ripe for us trying to do that.
I think what you mentioned is also interesting in terms of like how does a norm take hold or change in a group, right? And that it's not a norm necessarily that's kind of abstract and we collectively decide to go with it, right? But that individuals in power or higher prestige, they might be the important ones, the connectors somehow that change that, and to approach them is maybe most important, right?
Yeah, groups. I mean, norms involve enforcement, and there is a mechanism by which these norms are going to be enforced, and you have to understand how that's happening and where the enforcers get their cues for what behaviors they should be enforcing and what they shouldn't. And you know, I think actually there's a wonderful literature that grows out of Elinor Ostrom's work that gives really clear case studies of how norms are working in different communities and how they're supporting desired behaviors. There's stuff on the cattlemen of Shasta County that's really famous. There's stuff on the lobstermen that's really famous. There's great work on pirates that's really well known. And for me, actually, I love looking at those examples to see different ways that the community are enforcing the norms, because they give you like these really, you have a lot of detail there on how they're doing that. And then you can start to imagine, well, if I were in an environment that's more like that, how would I start to change the norms? Who would I have to talk to? Do they have an assembly politics? Is that how they're bringing the enforcers together and communicating the new norm to them? Do they have one guy who I just need to talk to, like they do at the mafia, and so on and so forth? So I think there isn't one answer. You have to understand that community, but you can start to get patterns by looking at some of these case studies. Okay.
So, I mean, what you seem to focus on, and maybe that's also reflective of the literature, is the norm enforcement, right? So that if you don't do it, then you be punished or there's some negative consequences. And maybe the iSpots results that it works more for these things, maybe points in that direction. But I mean, the other thing is also that maybe it creates some kind of achievement motivation, right? That this is the ideal. So it's not just like I get into trouble if I don't do that thing that most people here do, or the people who are successful do, but it just creates some kind of a goal for me in life or development or for the task at hand. So like Alex has written a paper recently about how achievement motivation and reputation might be linked. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So this is just work looking at how kids think about people who are reputationally motivated or not. So we know a lot of research that suggests that kids do pay attention to their reputation and can understand other people's reputational strategies a little bit. But the work that we were doing was just looking at young children and saying, here's this guy who only cares about seeming smart to other people. He really wants the best grades because he wants to seem smart. And then someone else who genuinely wants to be smart. And we just asked kids to make predictions about what kinds of behaviors these people would engage in. And what we found is, I guess this is a case where it's kind of interesting. You would think that that's a relatively trivial inference to make, but actually we found that really not until maybe six, maybe even 7 or 8 kids are able to make these kind of inferences. So if you ask them, who's likely to lie about failure and say that they didn't fail, they think the reputationally motivated kid. Who's likely to downplay their success, again, in a kind of modest way, the person who wants to seem smart. Who's likely to refuse to seek help publicly, again, the reputationally motivated kid. And not only do we find that, but we find that kids also dislike these people who pursue their reputations. I guess, did you want me to relate this to what Erez was talking about? I guess I'm happy to talk about my work, but I wasn't sure like exactly the connection between those two things.
No, that makes sense. No, this is great. Thanks. Let me move on to a question here from the audience that I think is interesting, because so far we talked about more in terms of how people might care about their reputation within their group or join a group. But the question here is more about competition. So here the question is from Rebecca Hanel-Peters. Are there different types of reputation that are harnessed to derogate competitors more so than other types of reputation, and whether there are sex differences in this potentially? Someone have something to say about this question?
I could answer that, but I guess, Erez, did you want to say something really quickly on the previous point? I feel like you were like, we're about to say something.
Oh, I see. Yeah, good.
I just want to distinguish reputation going on at an ultimate level and reputation going on at an approximate level in this discussion. So when we're talking about reputationally motivated analysis study, we're talking about people whose deliberate thought process is considering reputational effects. And most of this discussion has not been assuming that, and reputation has been acting underneath the surface in the background, shaping people's psychology, and they're not necessarily thinking about it.
Okay, thanks for that follow-up. So yeah, any thoughts about what kind of mechanisms there might be to derogate competitors?
Well, I can say a little bit that, so particularly for the part that there are like sex differences, yes, women and men compete on different things. And so on average, especially when you look at like the mating market kind of thing, when it comes to competitor derogation, you will derogate based on traits that are valued. So for example, for men often compete on resources and status. And that in the mating market, that's very important. For women, often it's more appearance based. And so same sex or like competitors will derogate based on those traits because they based on normative assumptions of what is valued, and they can vary based on communities and societies, but there will be different types of reputation that people will choose to derogate based on the strategic interests.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, let me move to the next question, which is, by Terence Doris Cruz, what is the definition of reputation that you use? And maybe we can expand it to think about like different kinds of reputation, how they, what we should distinguish here. Anyone who wanted to take that on?
I'll say that reputation is really hard to define. A few years ago, I went to a workshop on reputation and signaling, and that's one thing we talked a lot about, is that like, what is reputation? And it's very difficult to pin down. My own personal definition of it is it's a piece of information that you have that you can use to make a decision or judgment about that individual. It's very like simple and like, but there are many different definitions of reputation, and depending on the angle that the researcher takes, it will influence how they research it, etc.
Yeah, that's funny, right? There's always the trick one, like how do you really define it? We have some intuitive sense or we operationalize it, but how exactly to define it's always really tricky. Okay, so but thanks for taking this on. We have another question from Pat Barkley here. Are there any general principles for changing the norms about what is valued? So what brings a good reputation such that reputational pressures can then start to promote those behaviors? Who wants to answer that?
I think this one goes back to you've got to well, okay, it's hard again. I think I start by thinking about what it is that actually I'm going to ask for. And that process involves working with the folks in the community to figure out, they're often going to say things like fly less or whatever, if you're trying to encourage new norms around more climate conscious business behavior, say. And fly less is not something that's going to be enforceable for some technical reasons. So we have to actually refine that and basically make it so that it's more categorical. So the first part of the conversation is actually just like, what is the thing that we're going to ask for, and try to hone that so that it's something that we can ask for and make it as compelling as possible. Another example might be don't go out unless it's necessary, when we all heard during the early part of the pandemic. Unless it's necessary, not a very compelling ask. We want to hone that one. After that, the next step is the generating common knowledge that the norm is changing and getting those enforcers on board. And I should say, Felix is right. I keep saying enforcers, and that implies that these are punishments at play, but it could be rewards. It doesn't have to be punishments, but I'll use the shorthand of enforcers. And so having some sort of public messaging campaign that is considerate of the enforcement structure within the community for norms, that uses the folks at the top, that communicates things in a way that everybody knows that this thing is changing. That's the next step. And it's not the reason that I hesitated earlier is because because of the fact that norms are enforced differently in different communities, there isn't just one way to do this. You really need to understand the enforcement structure within the community, I think, in order to get this right. And then the final piece is just to figure out, and I guess this is very closely related, but you have to figure out a way to communicate. Well, that's good enough. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So let me ask a question for you. Like, what's the big outstanding question you have in your own research? Maybe you don't want to share that because that's part of a grant proposal or something. But like, what do you say are really the big outstanding question in the kind of field you are in with regard to reputation? There are no more questions? You've answered everything there is to answer in this research domain? No.
I will say, as a developmental psychologist, I'm very interested in the question. I don't care about how we define reputation, but I want to come up with satisfying ways of figuring out, like, when we believe that a child really has a conception of reputation. So there are some things that just definitely won't count, right? So for example, my dog's not here right now, but like my dog knows when I'm around and changes her behavior in some ways when I'm around. Just doing that can't count as a reputation because we don't really think that my dog has a representation of something like reputation. And so we want to start to think more and more about the thing that I would really like to understand a bit more as a big outstanding question is what are the, I don't even want to say necessary and sufficient, but I guess more and more trying to differentiate these cases of things that are just observational cues, or even another one. Let's say that Erez talked about like some kinds of enforcement strategies and things like that. Again, if you're talking about things that are not reputation based, like for example, let's imagine that when I'm walking down the street, I think that there's a big guy who might punch me in the face. Again, I might change my behavior. That again has nothing to do with reputation. That's a simple contingency of costs and benefits. Animals can, like really simple animals can do those kinds of things. And so I think in some circumstances, I've seen those kind of things lumped under this rubric of reputation when you're trying to avoid being punished by somebody else. And it could be, but it doesn't have to be. And so I guess that to me is a big open question that I would really like to pursue. And I think that's a good case where development, I think, helps us to see like, what are the parts that are harder for children? I'll mention what they are for people who aren't familiar with this area. So one thing that kids get pretty early is changing their behavior to look nicer and gain reputation. They get that by, some people say as early as age 3, I would say pretty securely by age 5. But what's harder for kids is, and this maybe relates to reputation, is the idea that other people are doing the same thing. That's something kids find harder to understand. So what I mean is, if I gave you the following vignette, I said, there's a person who's always generous in public. There's a person who is, but not private, or vice versa. They're always generous in private, but not public. It's really clear to us as adults which one of those is like the more kind person. But to 6 and 7-year-olds, it's actually not so obvious. 6 and 7-year-olds actually think sometimes, if anything, this is work by Gail Heyman and others, that the person who is generous in public is actually the nicer of those two people. And that just seems to be something that kids have a hard time understanding. Like they are manipulating their own behavior to influence their reputations in other people's minds, but they don't understand that other people are doing the same thing. And maybe that is like one of the keys to understanding this reputational thing, I think. But that's what I would like to pursue. I just like everyone said, I don't think I have a good answer. That's why I didn't jump in to answer that question about reputation. But I think it's actually good to proceed by excluding cases that we think really like seem reputation-y but aren't reputation, to get like some kind of handle on that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, this is in some sense an empirically driven approach to answering the question, what is reputation, right? Not in a deductive way, but really try to disentangle. And I totally resonate with that, because that's also my impression from looking at the literature, that early on kids really have this immediate situational understanding about immediate consequences that come depending on observability or not. And it takes them a really long time to really understand how, for example, people might talk about you, or someone not just being in the room has some access to what you're doing, and that will maybe have some future consequences, good or bad. But that's doesn't seem to emerge until maybe school age, or like elementary school age, or maybe into the double digits. Like 10-year-olds don't fully comprehend it in all kinds of situations where it would be pretty obvious to adults. So and I think that it is also related to the cognitive abilities, right? So this is also something that is really highlighted in the developmental research, and also the comparative research, that you need certain cognitive capacities in order to even process that information in the first place, right? So without these abilities, you wouldn't be able to even process what this means, that there is a certain expectation. So I think that's a really good, outstanding question. Who else? What are the big questions you think your field or research area needs to tackle?
I'm progressively becoming a lot more interested in larger scale influences on kind of signaling and reputation. So like population dynamics, socio-ecological, sociocultural variables, and how this will influence what reputations are valuable, how people signal those reputations, who they signal it to. And I think that's really interesting going forward, because reputation research is messy and it's highly variable. So another thing that I'm really interested in is just the subtleties that come with it, because it's not only I have this trait, but it's I have this trait. Is it valued in this context, in this population? Who is watching? Do they matter to me? Is it, for example, like a 2-year-old nonverbal kid who can't communicate it to anybody, or is it my boss? And where that matters a lot. How do you anticipate them using this reputational information? And so there's these complex psychological mechanisms that go into calculating people's behaviors. And I think that's really interesting to see how those mechanisms do influence reputation management, and to what degree.
Great, yeah, very, very good. And right, so you already alluded to the difficulty of the clean but maybe simple models, and how to translate that into the real world, or the way back. Is that the challenging question for you, what you do?
It is, and I think the question that Pat asked, the last question, where I was struggling to give a clean answer. I think for me, the main focus has been, for the last year or two, how do I talk about changing norms in ways that are coherent? And so it's not quite Pat's question, in that we kind of vaguely know how to change norms. We know this has to do with common knowledge and things like that. But how do I then go to somebody who works at an organization and say, okay, at your organization, there's the following problem, and you want to change the norm, you want to make it this. This is what you need to do. How do I have a consistent way of talking about that? We seem to have that once the behavior is normative already. I feel like we've got that one down pretty well, but I feel like we're really missing that for Pat's question. And so a lot of my effort and a lot of my thinking in spare time is going into that. We have a paper, for instance, talking about PSAs. How does one, if all you have available to you is the ability to say, write a sign, like we did when it came to COVID, for a lot of situations. All you could do is put up a sign, hope people social distance, hope they wash their hands more. Or I've been working a lot on waste lately. Turns out people don't put waste in the right bin, and that's really problematic. They throw out a lot of stuff that actually the main problem is that they recycle stuff they shouldn't be recycling, and that creates a major issue for us, and it makes it harder to recycle. And in that context, I might have a few levers, but the main lever I have is that sign that's right there. And so how do I change it? And there is a question of changing the norm a bit, because right now the norm appears to be leave stuff out of landfill. And that's the wrong norm. So given that all I have is a sign, can I get some lift? And if so, are there some general principles around designing such signs that I can then communicate to somebody? That's where I'm at.
Okay, thanks very much. I have a question here that I think is important. Sorry, no, I lost it. Sorry. Oh, yes. So the question is from Paul. How does social media interact or exploit our reputational psychology? I mean, that seems to be something where maybe it's all about reputation and you no way to really check with what's the real person behind it. So do you know have you any speculations about it, or even some empirical insights?
I'm happy to chat a bit about this one. Here, first of all, I think it's important to flag that which reputation is going to be important for answering that question. For some things, the answer is going to be pretty different than for others, for other types of reputation. One thing that we've noticed is that social media basically creates an incentive to search for evidence that you are of a certain type, or that you are that you are of certain types. And so it means that people have more of an incentive to do things that are Instagrammable, for instance, than they might have had before. And they have to spend more resources on that. And it's kind of shifted the equilibrium. Now since everybody else is doing that, if you don't do that, there's an inference drawn that you are not able to do that. And so you're kind of forced to do it. And there's some waste involved in that, actually, as a consequence. And so to analyze this kind of situation, we use models called evidence games models that show that people will reveal evidence in biased fashion and search for evidence in biased fashion. And also when an environment like social media arises, that they're forced to do so when they otherwise would not have.
Great.
Just to briefly echo that, we know that those kind of things happen for any kind of positional good. There are huge externalities for all these kind of things. So the example that the economist Robert Frank talks about is in like the 60s or 70s, there were no helmets in hockey. And if you ask the players, do you want the league to regulate it so everyone has to wear a helmet? All of them said yes, but nobody individually wore a helmet. And the reason is wearing a helmet actually makes it harder to win at hockey. And so if everyone else is not wearing a helmet, you can't wear a helmet, basically. And the social media thing ends up being something very similar. It would actually be better if we all only pursued those expensive Instagrammable moments once or twice a year or something like that. But if you're in an environment where now everybody has to do that, the utility that if part of the utility that you're getting is having a thing to brag about, if everyone is doing those things, you're wasting resources, just like Erez just said.
I wonder how, one feature of social media is obviously the breadth and maybe ease. Like you can just take a photo and upload it. So is there something about the speed at which things are happening? So I think this is maybe something, if you write a letter and put it in your mailbox and the next morning you realize, oh, maybe I should not send that nasty letter to my boss or friend or someone, you can rip it and put it in the recycling bin, right? That's the right approach here. But if you just shoot off an email or post something on Facebook or somewhere, then immediately everybody can see it. So I think what this means, I guess, is that there's also a problem about repairing what you did. Is much harder because the whole world sees it. It's not, you can't just apologize to the one person you've insulted, maybe. But everybody can see it and everybody might have an opinion about it. So is that something that resonates with our experts here?
Yeah, I'll just very quickly say one quick thing with that, which is just that the speed really is a problem, and these programs aren't randomly creating this stuff. So here's the problem. One is that the social media apps are getting better and better at trying to make it more and more addictive, to create it so that it's not just snorting cocaine, basically, it's smoking crack, meaning it's even quicker the hit of fame that you can possibly get. I've heard, at least I've never been on TikTok just yet, but I've heard this is why TikTok is so addictive. It's deliberately designed so that you can become very famous very quickly. And that actually really increases the addictiveness of that particular platform. The other thing is, you're talking about these repair things. That's also the stuff that's likely to spread on social media. The way these algorithms work, it's things that are going to get engagement from people. And engagement doesn't necessarily mean positive things. It can mean negative things. And so it's a double problem, which is your information gets out there really quickly. And the information that is likely to propagate through social media is information that might be very likely to damage you and create these kind of messes that then you can't correct. And so I guess the original question was, Are social media exploiting our reputational psychology? Absolutely, and in non-random ways that are really destructive.
And I'll just add that Meltem's comment, I feel like, also is relevant and complementary to this discussion. The fact that things are permanent is also potentially makes repair difficult.
Yeah, that's great. Let me read that question so we're all on the same page here. So following up on Paul's social media question, Meltem asks, what do you all think about the ethics of the permanence of social media? Is it beneficial for us as a group to know about someone's tweets from years ago? What if they were 10 years old and if they were old enough, etc.? Yeah, Amanda, did you?
Oh, I was going to add on the previous comment is that also just the opacity of these algorithms will influence it, and particularly like as Alex said, the platforms have incentive to keep you on there. They want you, and so they will biasly show whatever comments you have to people who will be more likely to engage with it, and therefore almost kind of creating the selection for stronger views in that kind of vein, whether it be positive or negative. And so I would expect that it would create more of like these echo chambers and almost increased polarization of certain views, because you are getting feedback by people who will be interacting with this. So it will not only like promote people to get a better reputation or worse, but it will also amplify the messaging as well, given the audience is selecting for, and you have very little control over that.
Yeah, so yeah, that's really interesting. And Alex's paper from years ago, reputation is everything, rings true more and more, right? like in this kind of way, and it stays also everything. Yeah, great. We have another question from Saeed asking, how much do we know about the role of reputation in shaping morally accepted codes? Basically, did moral codes shape reputation concerns or the other way around? So I think that's a really interesting question, because you could imagine that there's certain types of moral codes that exist independently of reputation, and that it's more about making sure it's really happening. But then there are also maybe other things that maybe merge just based on the fact that reputation exists, right? So is that maybe something that we could think comes from the fact that we live in social markets where we try to find the right people to hang out with? Is that are there certain different kinds of norms that we can really trace back to reputation, the existence of reputation itself?
I feel like this one's a question for you guys. The way I think about it, and I'm hoping you'll correct me, is we kind of have an evolved facility for keeping track of reputations, of knowing, when a behavior might influence our, having an intuition, when a behavior might influence our reputation, of when we're supposed to reward or punish people based on those reputations. And that facility just kind of exists. It's kind of a Rob Boyd argument, I think. And then exactly what ends up being the behaviors that are demanded and the associated moral codes, that ends up being culturally variant and dependent on the situation, and culture evolved for reasons that are kind of outside my model. And that's typically how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, along those lines, what I could say is that morality varies a lot across cultures and what is valued. There are some points of conservation across the different moral codes, but even a lot of morality-based researchers disagree on what are the different points of morality. Like one main category is like cooperation, generosity, which is fairly consistent across most moral codes, but many others do vary what is appropriate and what isn't. So will depend on the selection pressures within those communities about what is valued. Now, with that said, the role of reputation in shaping morally accepted codes, basically, yeah, I would almost say like whatever is valued in that, then that's when reputation becomes valuable. If you do deviate from that norm, from what is morally expected, and then then punishment would be involved if you do deviate too much outside of what is expected of you. But I'm not too sure in how reputation itself would shape the moral code. Morality often is viewed as a way to create these standards, create these norms that are beneficial for, on average, for the community. But yeah, so I'm not too sure about the role of reputation in shaping morality, but reputation is highly involved in maintaining that code, in coercing others to maintain it.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, go ahead, Felix.
I was just trying to add. So I think, yeah, Amanda, that's right. It's really important to think about different kinds of moral codes or conceptions of morality, because under one description, if you care about reputation, then it's no longer a morally motivated behavior you're exerting, right? So that really depends on that. But that's probably not how we would think about it empirically, that this is what actually guides people's behavior. Yeah, Alex, please.
I was just going to say, there's a couple ways that this question could have been meant for, but if the question is how do you change people's and figure out like what's going to become the accepted moral code, moral argument tends to be pretty bad at this. Social influence tends to be pretty good. If that's what he means by reputation in this way, like I think the myth, there's like people become more liberal when they go to college, I think a lot of the time. And like some people think it's like, oh, I'm just hearing these really careful arguments and that's why they become more liberal. It's like, no, it seems like mostly you become more liberal because you're surrounded by lots of other liberals when you go to college and things like that. It seems like most of the evidence seems to suggest that social influence does a lot of this work. Good arguments might help some of that, but it seems like social influence does a lot of the work of figuring out what becomes the accepted moral code in different areas.
Great, thanks very much. I have a question. So when looking back at your own work or what has happened in the field, what is something that has most surprised you as something that you would not have expected to have found, or generally a result that just really clashes with expectations?
When I first started working on this stuff, I was consistently surprised about the magnitude of the observability effects when it came to promoting cooperation. I remember I had a conversation, one of the first conversations when I started working on this, with somebody outside who was working with the organization I was collaborating with, and they were like, this stuff doesn't matter. All people care about is money. And the effect sizes we found of observability ended up being 7 times the effect size of the bonus they were paying in that particular setting. And that surprised me. But also at the time we had done a review of the lab literature. We'd also found really big effect sizes in the lab. 30%, 50%, 150%, 300% increases in donations and dictator games and public good games and so on, when you, depending on exactly the observability intervention and exactly the setting, but really big effects. And when you look at other stuff, people make a big deal out of like 6%. And so I was really surprised about that. Now that I think of public goods contributions and cooperative behavior as being largely motivated by reputation, maybe I'm not so shocked by it anymore. It's kind of obvious. But I think it required a shift in perspective, and it's easy to forget that initially, and for people maybe who are new to this, they're maybe not thinking about the role, because maybe there are good reasons why we don't think about reputations and try not to deliberate through our reputations, as Alex was alluding to earlier. It can sometimes be surprising to realize just what a big role reputation is playing and how big observability effects can be.
Great example, thanks.
I'm going to add on that because mine was in a similar vein, but different. So I was also surprised at the fleetingness of some of the observability effects. And the reason being is that it really depends on what you're being watched for. Is it something that is very valuable that will enhance or be detrimental to your reputation, or will it have very little effect? Is whatever you're doing ambiguous, hard to interpret? And so basically in context where people don't think that whatever they do will matter to the person who's watching them. Like if I don't know, somebody's watching me who's like super like, we'll just say extreme on like pro environmentalism or whatever else, well, there might be some actions like, I don't know, me like helping somebody out on something completely unrelated or going to the gym. They don't care. Like, that doesn't matter. My reputation won't matter in that context. But if I did something that was pro-environmental, then they would care. So so although observability effects can be very, very large, it really depends on who is watching, the context, and the content of the actions. So sometimes they're very, very small and they're fleeting.
Great, thanks very much. Alex, what's your most surprising observation?
I mentioned one of them before, just the things that children find difficult in reputation. I find that interesting. The other is a thing I guess I briefly alluded to before, is just how much people's positions are influenced by social influence and reputation and things like that. Like, I guess as I've gotten older, I've just seen people who, like, their positions have just radically changed. I have friends I grew up in like a relatively conservative high school, and I see these people who like were over the top pro-Bush people who like were talking about bombing all of these Arabs and things like that in a very positive way. And now they are woker than woke. And it's so interesting to me the way that people are just really heavily influenced by their environment. I think I just happen to have the opposite orientation, which is I have the Oscar Wilde quote, which is, whenever other people agree with me, I feel I must be wrong. And so like whenever I'm in an environment where everyone is saying the same thing, I have this natural tendency to be like, maybe that's not right. So but that is just something I found very interesting. Maybe it's just because I'm not that kind of person.
Well, it's because you're a scientist. I mean, that's we're programmed in to try to disagree. All right. But there are a lot of consensus, though, even though we're all scientists. So I want to thank you very much. I think this is now time to wrap up and pass it on to Paul. Is that right? You wanted to give some final thoughts?
Yep, that's right. So thank you all. Our time is almost up today. Before we go, I would again like to thank our moderator, our speakers, for this wonderful discussion, really interesting, as well as the Executive Council for their support of the series, and all of you for being here. So keep your eyes out for announcements about the December Roundtable and other future events in the coming weeks. And finally, we welcome feedback from HBES members to improve the event. So if you have any comments, you can email them at hbesroundtableseries@gmail.com, and I put that in the chat. So that's it. Thank you all so much, and hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah, thanks very much.